On today's World Insight, economic gloom after COVID-19 boom, what it means for U.S. companies in China, in the words of the AmCham chairman.
70% of our members reflect that they have no intention to change their investment plans.
And tally of coronavirus infections exceeds 3 million. The milestone begs the question, how can nations band together to turn the tide of the pandemic?
Demonizing your opponent, or sometimes by exaggerating the flaws and downplaying the virtues of your opponent.
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello, I'm Tian Wei, and welcome to World Insight. The COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted global supply chains, with factories, big and small, grinding to a screeching halt. As global companies learn to cope with the unprecedented disruptions, what's in store for the post-pandemic global market? Are foreign companies leaving China? In a recent survey by AmCham China, 70% of the surveyed U.S. companies said they would not move productions out of China. Earlier, I sat down with Greg Gilligan, the chairman of AmCham China. He said presenting accurate data and information like what AmCham is trying to do may help bridge understanding and restore business confidence between the world's two largest economies. Let's listen in. I'm on your newsletter, so I've been receiving surveys one after another. So some of the latest number, please.
Sure. Well, first let me just mention the combination of the many surveys that we have are all relevant to one another and how we interpret our situation right now. So every year we do an annual business climate survey. We completed that in November. Now the significance, of course, of that is that it was pre-Phase 1 trade deal and pre-COVID-19. Then, once we had a trade deal in place, we had some additional feedback from members, and then we had the unfortunate outbreak of COVID-19. So we started to do surveys relative to all of these things and then compare the data. The data, however, surprisingly, perhaps, not to me, but perhaps surprisingly to many of our audiences, remains very consistent. One way it's consistent is in American businesses' desire to continue to invest in China, and in fact ranking among the top 3 of global investment destinations. Now naturally, given the trade tensions of the last 2 years and the COVID-19 outbreak, there are modifications to that, and I'd be happy to share some detail.
What do you mean by modifications?
We can break things down probably into 3 large categories. One is short-term plans and what those plans mean for supply chain and investment. And then there's longer-term plans, and by that I mean 3 to 5 years. And then also about what the business community views of the U.S.-China relationship and how that will impact those 2 things. So if we look at the short term, 70% of our members reflect that they have no intention to change their investment plans. There are a number of folks that are looking at some elements of supply chain. However, largely, ones that have moved supply chain have already done so. And that was a reaction in the past probably to measures of cost. Tariffs certainly factor into that. But over the long term, there's been other changes in the cost of labor and rising wages and cost of supply, et cetera. So what we see is a large commitment to staying the course, but then there's about 24% of the membership that are looking at making adjustments to supply, and 12% looking at making adjustments to production.
Interesting. Do these vary from one sector to the other?
Yeah, and particularly on the investment side. And so where I would say there's less optimism are in technology and the service sectors, because they face certain headwinds that which would include the U.S.-China relationship broadly. And so they have moderated their view on future investment.
What you have just said to me
I think is the general impression I've also got when talking to various businesses
Yes.
from the United States that are here. So I would think the information you're providing are very accurate in a way. On the other hand, though, politics is getting ever more complicated.
Sure.
And it's layered up now with the so-called before coronavirus, BC, and AC after coronavirus, which of course is changing a lot of things, at least for the short term. So how do you, in AmCham, looking at the long-term nature of relationship between China and the United States and the short-term, possibly short-term, we don't know, effect of COVID-19? How are these two factors impacting, how you are communicating with your members and adjusting your plans?
Sure. Things change so rapidly, particularly in the last several months, that we need to reach out on a weekly basis and sometimes daily to both the U.S. government and to China government, and then reflect what we're hearing and what we're sharing to the membership. And it's a continuous feedback loop, because the membership says, gee, we wish you would bring this particular ask to China government and that particular ask to the U.S. government. And so what we try to do is stay objective, stay down the middle, and be a bridge.
How can you do that? I mean, who are you talking to on the Chinese side, and who are you talking to on the U.S. side, if I could ask?
Oh, certainly. Naturally, on the U.S. side, we talk to the U.S. Embassy here in Beijing all the time, and they have various functions and specialties across all the things you would expect, whether it's agriculture or technology, commerce in general, etc. And then on the China side, we naturally speak on a regular basis with the Ministry of Commerce, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the NDRC, MIIT, the Market Regulation Administration, etc. I mean, we had a recent call where, supported by China government, and they had 11 ministries on the call with us, engaging with 400 plus of our members. And so we were able to cover a very broad spectrum of ideas and needs and requests. So we have a really broad outreach.
Sounds very productive, what you have been engaging with. On the other hand, Greg, how do you look at politics this year? This is an election year for the United States.
Yes.
How do American businesses around the world, particularly here in China, where there is a geopolitics game going on between China and the United States, try to deal with this reality? I would assume a lot of uncertainties and crises to have to deal with every day.
And uncertainties and crisis and sometimes tension is because we're humans and we have, human nature.
Now you become very philosophical.
Yeah.
Is that part of the job?
I think it has to be. Because what it really is about bridging understanding. We have two different cultures, two very different languages, and all of that can lead to increased misunderstanding. However, what we have are two peoples that share a lot of common values and goals. And so we need to kind of find those areas of commonality and continue to work on those areas of difference. My predecessor, Tim Stratford, phrased it in a way that I really like, and he said, 和而不同, which is something in the equivalent of understanding and respecting each other's differences, right, and coming together. And so that's what we try to do at the Chamber, because commerce, frankly, is the largest part of the U.S.-China relationship. And maybe if we can get this right, it will help the other areas of the relationship.
Totally understand the way of thinking. However, Greg, if I could just use one or two examples. Recently, we've been hearing media reports about the Republican Senate campaigns during this election year, suggesting to their candidates to attack China as a way of winning over the Democrats. So there are specific lines about how to do the attacks and what to do, to what lens, and about which issue. I wouldn't go through all of them because they are designed by the strategists, and they are, many of them, in Washington. So what you have just said is that you are trying to deal with the impact on business once they are really impacting. But what about all of these signs that are trying to push the two countries further apart, that are further stir the water while the water could be calm? So, Greg, what about that? What does that mean for your job as, the chairman of AmCham, who are trying to promote this trade relationship?
What we do is we differentiate between rhetoric and action.
But sometimes rhetoric leads to action because the public mood are going to be changing as a result of that.
Sometimes rhetoric is very unfriendly, but there's not really any action that's followed up by it. Sometimes rhetoric is very friendly, but there's nothing really supportive in action. And so we always compare the two to see, what to believe, what to spend our time on. And then, again, coming back to our role, we reflect objective information to both sides in the same way. We gather data, and we share that data, along with what we think are the issues and how to solve them. So again, we try to just play it down the middle and be that, constructive force.
Economic gloom in the wake of the pandemic. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, recently scaled down its forecast for the year 2020 world GDP growth to negative 1.5%. So how could businesses, local and foreign, survive despite looming uncertainties? Let's hear what Mr. Gilligan had to say during the interview.
We see business people, particularly some of the most distinguished members, as we have seen these days in the U.S., playing different roles and having different approaches.
Sure.
Bill Gates, for example, of course, he's more than a business person. He's a global philanthropist. He has been speaking out in the public health crisis about the preparedness and about global cooperation. While others seem to be more behind-the-scenes advisors to the current president in the administration. So, Greg, obviously business people are choosing different approaches and different roles as they consider as important for either their personal good or the public good. What is the role, do you think, Greg, as the chairman of AmCham, that business people should play? Because after all, you're working with more than several thousand business people that are doing business here in China.
Yes. So we try to build on positive momentum. We stay away from too much of the politics. Again, the two political systems are so different. Yeah. And in today's news cycle, there may be one hot story, and tomorrow it'll be something different. But over the longer term, the foundation of the relationship, the anchor and the propeller of the U.S.-China relationship is commerce. And so if we can work to strengthen that, it should benefit the larger relationship.
But it's not even China and the United States. It's also within your country. For example, some are talking about let's do global cooperation. Without that, none of us could survive. And the public health crisis certainly demonstrates that.
Right.
Others are saying, no, right? I mean, it's having an impact on our economy, and that is exactly the time when we should look inward. So you have that debate going on in your country too.
Of course.
So how would businesses deal with those, very different voices also on your home turf? And how is that reflected here when you're doing business overseas in a country like China?
Well, if you look at our recent survey results, many of them, it's about 50 or 52%, say that it's too soon to tell what to make of COVID impact and what to take from that impact into investment and supply chain plans. So again, that's coming back to business being cool-headed about let's gather more data, and maybe when they're at 70% of data, then they'll make a decision to try to stay ahead of the market. But business people have a very solid way of filtering out the politics and focusing on the marketplace, who we serve in society, shareholders, customers, etc.
That probably has also a lot of relations with the debate about globalization, because many of the companies you have here are multinationals and they are global companies on their own.
Sure.
So over the past few decades, there were glorious times of multinational companies, and people have a huge respect for them. But over the past 10 years, shall we say, we see some side effect of globalization, and therefore they, quote unquote, seem to have this original sin. So how, on the one hand, being a pioneer, trying to promote global business and bringing jobs both at home and to the economies where they operate, while at the same time deal with this quote-unquote original sin, that it seems that whatever they say or they do will be colored in a very different way. So this, to me, is a very interesting phenomenon, Greg.
Globalization is controversial. However, there's so many people that benefit from it. And the two largest economies in the world need to do better in handling this particular topic. The U.S. previously was seen as a leader of globalization and efforts, but of recent years is seen retrenching and moving away from globalization. China is very vocal with being a champion of globalization, and so it's necessary for both sides to figure out how do we narrow that lane of, let's say, national security and law enforcement so that we can broaden the other areas. And that way we can preserve the areas of globalization that should be preserved while still protecting the vested interest of each country.
But then, Greg, how to ask business leaders to decide what they need to do? Well, they are trying to deal with constant crises and unpredictabilities. So there has to be some fundamental morals or principles that they have to hold in their heart very dearly so that every time it could be much clearer. But that's very difficult. You are a business leader yourself. You run your own business while at the same time serving as chairman of AmCham. So tell me about your thinking process these days when engaging, when doing business, when talking to your members.
I've been philosophical myself recently.
Yeah.
And as an American, the way I process where we are right now is that 9/11 changed America, and it changed the way Americans think in many ways. But now COVID-19 is the global 9/11. We all realize that the world has changed. And there is no stronger demonstration that we live in a global village than what we've been going through these last several months. And so when one thinks about decoupling and, retrenching and just being, isolated or independent of others, you realize that that's not possible, that global health and welfare depends on countries cooperating properly, whether it's to fight the virus or to do economic stimulus, to preserve global supply chain that feeds people or keeps doctors and nurses safe. There's just so many things that we can't walk away from, because if we did, we'd be harming ourselves. And so business needs to look at that. It can't be entirely about cost. It needs to be about cost benefit and how you weigh the two. And so that's where, you take those two things and then you take narrowing those other lanes I talked about so we can broaden the areas of cooperation in business to the benefit of human health and welfare.
What about the immediacy of policies? We see different governments use different sets of policies. How would you compare many of the businesses that you are having here in terms of the China policy, because they could also be subject to the China policy, while at the same time subject to the American policy? How does that work?
Well, it needs to go beyond just the U.S. and China, and if you think about maybe the G20 or even more broadly than that, we need governments and central banks around the world to work in concert to get the economy back on its feet. Stopping work was very necessary in many places and less necessary in others, but restarting an economy is much harder than stopping it. And so you can restart productivity and back to work measures, but there's still the demand side. And so right now, people go back to work, they have their employees back, and their factories are running, and the supply lines are up.
Where's the market?
But that's a measure of cost. And so we need then demand to come back, and demand is going to be that fiscal and monetary policy that supports small business and individuals so that they can actually consume.
But will people's needs, in other words, demands, very different as a result of this crisis?
There will be a lot of change, of course.
Like what you're looking at?
Well, consumption may differ in how it happens. For instance, there may be a much greater shift to e-commerce. Now, China's e-commerce is exceptionally developed, more so, I would say, than e-commerce in the United States. So we'll probably see a very large uptick, and you have seen that in many companies in the U.S. that are in the digital commerce space. In the same way that we saw new opportunity come out of SARS in 2003. I mean, if you look at the growth of, say, Alibaba and Jingdu and others, much of that was driven by, the new reality post-SARS. And so we'll probably see something similar, I would say, in the United States. And that'll create new opportunity. We have a lot of our members, and this is in the service sector, that reflect that previously they always had to get onto a plane or a train to go convince their clients to do something. Now they get on, WeChat or Tencent or Zoom or
Skype,
whatever,
yeah.
And they have virtual meetings. And their clients suddenly are okay with that and then can move forward. So we'll see a lot of shifting and adaptation in business.
Final few questions.
Please.
How are businesses preparing if there were, knock the wood, but we never know. It's really the virus that you said, a second or a third wave. How would business even survive?
It's challenging. More than 40% of our members reflect in surveys that they are looking at cost-cutting measures. Another, it's probably 33% are revising their budgets entirely. And so, but those are short-term measures. I want to emphasize that that's sort of 2020 related. And then I'll speak again to over the longer term, 3 to 5 years, there's many more people that say, let's stay the course. But there's still a significant sector, and again, this is near half, that say we need more information, it's too soon to tell. So whether that's on the investment side or the adjustment of supply chain, I know supply chain is always so controversial. People want to they want to call the change in supply chain today, but there's not enough information to say that that's coming. Less than 1% of our members say that they're making changes to their long-term supply chain, but there is a solid half that say we're still looking at this. So we need to stay objective and work with the data we have and then continually update it as we do. Our recent surveys we've been doing on a 30-day basis. So as soon as we're done with one, we're preparing for the next one, and then we reflect that.
Greg, it's such a pleasure talking to you. I have to say, nobody is jealous of your job these days.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure.
Thank you so much, sir.